right. My name is Kavana Anderson, and I'm the Director of Learning and Community Engagement at Duke Gardens, another white-led university botanic garden on native land down the road. Also interested in self-awareness and critical self-reflection as well as resource sharing. I hope that you're all feeling well-nourished by your lunch, both the food, round of applause. Yeah, so nourished by the food for thought from the sessions this morning. There were so many lessons about purpose and path and partnership between people and plants and the whole community of life. Jesslyn really highlighted the partnerships that made this day possible, that brought us all together in this room today. And I'm excited to think about the partnerships that will come from having been brought together in this room. I wanted to just invite us all to share one deep breath together, one way to be in partnership with each other, as well as the plants that we're in partnership through our cycle of breath. So we'll do one inhale and exhale and settle in for this next session on river cane restoration. It's going to be a two-part session. So we're first going to have Aaron Baumgardner, an ecocultural restorationist from Catawba Nation, joining us to talk about some river cane restoration efforts going on there. And he will be followed by Ryan Dial from the Lumbee tribe, who works at the American Indian Center, and they'll both add to their own introductions, and we'll get to know them through the course of their presentation. So Aaron, you'll get us started.
Tanaka nitem yabkri nia Aaron ye katabare ye iswangre ye manu kuinangre itusre ye wasap kachacheng yankaping sawacha hawo kavana hawo Jesslyn hawo nitem. Hello everyone and good day. My name's Aaron. I'm Catawba, a person of our great river. What did I say? I am the Director of Natural Resources at Catawba Nation. I'm also an artist. I make baskets, I do pottery, and I also teach our citizens. I just wanted to say thank you to Kavana for the introduction, as well as Jesslyn for the invitation, and also for all of you for being here. So welcome. So let's see here. Oh, there we go. A little bit of a lag. But I'm going to do a presentation outline. I am a bit nerdy, so I wanted to outline the presentation and how you make a basket. So first, you prepare your splints, right? So I'll kind of introduce river cane through natural and cultural history as it relates to Catawba and other southeastern people. Once we've sort of prepared the splints, which if you don't know what a splint is, it's basically every part of the basket is a splint. We'll talk about laying the stakes, which is the bottom of the basket that then turns to the upright part of the basket, by talking about recent restoration efforts on Catawba tribal land, as well as how to upset the basket. So actually going from a two-dimensional mat to a three-dimensional basket is called upsetting that basket. So we're going to relearn basketry together. Weaving the basket, so the actual horizontal elements or the weavers that start to create pattern, where we'll teach our basketry to our citizens. And then ultimately a basket's not complete without a rim. And so binding that rim is going to be creating strong partnerships for the future. So to get into some natural and cultural history, if you don't know, well, you probably don't know, but in Catawba, river cane is Wong Sa. So everyone want to say Wong Sa together? Wong Sa. You now have graduated elementary Catawba, so congratulations. Wong Sa, or river cane, or in the scientific name Arundinaria gigantea, is similar in morphology to bamboo, but distinctly different, mostly from a cultural perspective, and it's not as invasive. I wish it was invasive. But it does have very similar characteristics in that it mostly reproduces vegetatively through underground rhizome systems, which gives rise to new culms that then sort of have that very distinct culm node internode system. On the right is sort of a leaf sheath, and then also the branching pattern, which you'll kind of notice that the branching pattern on river cane is almost parallel to the culm, whereas with invasive bamboo, it's typically almost perpendicular to the comb. The other thing that you probably can't see too much here is that the actual note itself is a little bit distinctly different than bamboo, where there's sort of a bumpy side. I don't know what the scientific term is, but then it has a smooth side, whereas bamboo typically has two rigid bumps instead of one on the bottom side and a smoother one on the top. So to give a little bit of context about the landscape that we're on, we're in the Piedmont of the Carolinas, and the Piedmont of the Carolinas looked vastly different from what it does today, right? Most of us kind of associate these sort of pine landscapes or forested landscapes, but back in the day, it was much different, right? It was dominated by these grasslands and also these savanna landscapes that really allowed people to thrive. So, you know, I'm wearing my Merciless Indian Savage shirt today, so I'll call myself a savage. But the early explorers described what it was like, right? And they saw that these savages, when they go hunting, tis then they burn the woods. So they're doing active prescribed burning. Indians firing the cane swamps, which drives out the game. So they were also burning those river cane breaks. And then on the landscape also existed large megafauna like buffalo that ranged upon the savannas and retired to those cane breaks in the heat of the day. So a much different landscape with cute little bison and elk. York County in particular, which is where the current Catawba Reservation is described as the land of cane breaks, prairies, and savannas. And the cane breaks in the rivers and streams and on the extensive prairies, the early pioneers and hunters found large herds of buffalo and elk. The trees stood so far apart that a deer or a buffalo could easily be seen at a long distance, right? And so that, again, doesn't really exist in the context of what we see today, right, in terms of the landscape. A lot of the cane breaks are gone as well as the prairies. And so we have a 6,000 year history in the Piedmont. That's the low end of the idea of how long we've been here, but we've probably been here much longer than that. But to us, we've really been here since time began, right? Our creation story is where first woman follows a scarlet butterfly along the Catawba River to a waterfall where she meets Skyman, and that's really where people became existent. And so over that 6,000 year history, we've had a lot of impact on the ecosystem, right? And so I like to view not only Catawba, but most Southeastern people as ecosystem engineers. And so if you don't know what an ecosystem engineer is, it's a species on the landscape that really is actually actively changing the landscape itself. So think about a beaver creating a dam. That's changing the environment. Buffalo also were an ecosystem engineer where they were able to wallow and create these almost sort of ephemeral ponds and whole ecosystems that don't really exist anymore here. But people themselves were a part of that landscape in a healthy way, and for thousands of years, right, we were an active part of that landscape. And so if you think about prairie systems in particular, not necessarily the cane breaks themselves, why did they exist? One, you don't necessarily think of the Southeast as having a low precipitation. So the tall grass prairies of sort of the eastern Great Plains receive about half as much precipitation as the Carolinas. So it's not really indicative of prairie landscapes because it's much more the word for wet here than a xeric landscape out west. The other thing that a lot of the early explorers also noted was this timing of fires. And so these fires were a lot of the times in the dormant season when we didn't have thunderstorms to create those fires. And so they were being set off by people, right? And you kind of see that through Lawson and other explorers describing that the Native Americans in the region were actively setting these fires for game, clearing land, et cetera. And then over the course of that 6,000 plus year history, you can see that that landscape changes. And so why did we do all these different types of management strategies on the land and stewarding the land in a way that allowed us to live is really because we had different resources off of that land. River cane in particular was used for just about anything you can possibly think of. It was the plastic of the past. One of the things that I love the most about river cane is its ability to be made into a basket. And so on the right is a Catawba made river cane basket from the early 1900s, which was actually the last Catawba recorded river cane basket until more recently when we brought it back to the tribe. This I got to actually visit in the Smithsonian a week ago, which was pretty awesome. Got to map out the pattern. Another thing that river cane was used for was for weapons, right? We used spears. We would use them for blow guns, as well as fish traps and everything like that. And then importantly to Catawba people is our pottery. And so we used river cane for scraping tools or smoothing tools or whatever you could possibly think of. It was a tool for everything you can imagine that you'd need in life. And while pottery is an unbroken tradition within the Catawba community, we at least have been doing it for 4,000 years, and some say much longer than that. It's been intergenerationally exchanged for that 4,000 year period. On the left is my great great grandmother Rachel. On the right is myself, Star. But again, something that stayed with the tribe, whereas basketry really declined. And I think that basketry really declined because of the lack of our stewardship of the land, right? We were forcibly removed from the land and kind of reserved to these small reservations. We lost that relationship to the plants. And while clay takes millions of years to produce, you know, a couple generations of not setting those fires and a couple generations of not really being active stewards of those cane breaks means that when the fires go away and all that other types of stewardship goes away, so too do those healthy cane breaks. Oh no, it disappeared. So what are we doing, right? We are actively restoring river cane on the landscape, as well as kind of stewarding the ones that already exist, because it is really everywhere if you look close enough, but it's not some of those other pictures that I showed where it's these, 20, 30 foot tall columns of river cane that are great for different tools. So first and foremost, what we do is just simply remove invasive species from the landscape. And I will say that pictures of green isn't always the best. But on the left is a very invaded ecosystem where there's privet and honeysuckle and other types of non-native species that are just choking out river cane. And so what we do is we go through, we apply chemicals to a minor extent, but also do a lot of mechanical removal. And then on the right, you can actually see the response where those small little river cane that, were probably a foot or so are now, 10 or so feet high. What I will say is that this is only really the last couple of years. So these river cane aren't necessarily thick enough to really do much with from a tool perspective or a basketry perspective, but they're starting to get healthier and healthier, and we see that in the work that we're able to do. Again, bringing back that stewardship of a cane break so that it can be healthy to be able to live off of in tandem with the people. Something we've also started to do is transplant rhizomes into raised beds. So one thing that I said is that they reproduce vegetatively under the ground. So there's sort of an underground, it's not a root, it's a rhizome, which I think is a modified stem, I believe. You can dig it up, cut it, and they have like these almost fingernail-like structures, which then shoot up new culms. So what we do is and you can do this with a shovel, you don't have to do it with a skid steer, but we just are lucky enough to have skid steers. So we take the forks from the skid steer, just dig it into the ground underneath an existing river cane break, pull up that river cane, get access to those rhizomes, which you can see that sort of calloused area that's going to shoot up a new culm where the thumb is. And then we just simply place the river cane back down. And then what we do with our our rhizomes that we've harvested is we'll actually take them to our greenhouse where we'll plant them, and we'll just sort of nurse them and allow them to grow. And so over the course of time, we've gotten really thick stands of river cane in a greenhouse setting. And so what we'll actually do is we'll come back in here, take a front end loader, pick up the entire chunk of soil and river cane, and then just simply move it to a place in the field that doesn't have river cane to sort of establish a new population. So when we do that, we do some preparation where we'll usually do a light tillage of the area that we're going to do. So this is sort of near a stream that had a large erosional problem. River cane's great for kind of creating stable soils. We'll go in, we'll plant the rhizomes, and then we'll lay down there we go. a fabric that sort of allows the river cane to shoot up and then also prevents any sort of animals from getting stuck in the fabric, unlike that sort of plastic fabric that's typically used. This is like a adjustable coconut husk fiber. And then, just letting it do its natural thing, river cane will start to come up within a couple weeks. This area was hit hard with the recent flooding from the hurricane. So, you know, not the best shape, right? Some infrastructure kind of washed out, but again, just given enough time, these little river cane can become resilient again and really stabilize those banks. The last method that we use when we're doing river cane restoration is what we deemed the chunk and plunk method. This one you do need more expensive equipment, but we do use a backhoe, if it gets there, where we'll go to an existing population of river cane, simply pick up the river cane and then move it to another site where there's not river cane to establish a new population. So this population is actually at a neighboring county park that they're going to be building a trail system through their cane breaks. So we have an agreement with them where they were able to go in and harvest on a regular basis to then bring it back to the reservation where we can place it along our existing trail system as a way to establish a continuous border of river cane. And so we'll take it back to the reservation and then we'll simply plop it down and then sort of do some minimal kind of patch up work. So it's not just like a chunk of dirt sitting on the ground, but that it'll kind of expand itself outward. We do have a lengthy video that we're not going to show, but if you are interested, there's a QR code for like everything we do within Catawba Nation when it comes to restoration. It's 27 minutes. I'm going to wait until everyone takes out their phone. Just kidding. One of the big things that I've been most excited about this project isn't just the ecological. Oh, there's my voice. I hate it. But one of the most exciting things about this project isn't really the ecological restoration. So I'm trained as a plant ecologist. That's my life. But really what it's allowed us to do for our community, which is really reintroducing methods by which we create baskets by learning from our neighbors as well as learning from our ancestors. And so as part of this sort of larger river cane project, I've really worked with our cultural center, and we've had opportunities to actually go up to Eastern Band of Cherokee and learn from people within their community. They have a really active river cane basketry tradition that hasn't lost itself like the Catawba river cane basketry tradition. So we went up to Cherokee where they have really healthy stands of river cane and worked with an artist to actively harvest cane and then go down to splint making, creating natural dyes. So actually going through the process by which to get black walnut dye or bloodroot dye and then dyeing those splints so that it creates beautiful patterns. We had a third workshop, so this was a series of 4 workshops, where we then, in the third one, actually built baskets, which is a long process. This was a week's worth of work plus all the stuff beforehand. And it was a wonderful and amazing experience that, I hope that it inspires future people in the tribe to want to take on, because, everyone, which is a good thing that we want to do pottery, an unbroken tradition, but baskets deserve their light too. So with the last workshop that we did as a part of this grant was do a mat making class. So we worked with other Cherokee artists and brought them down to the reservation and actually learned how to take the scraps that were left from our baskets to then make mats. And mat making is definitely less intense and really creates really great avenues to create stories. That, baskets are beautiful, but mats might be a better introduction to how people get into river cane art. It's less frustrating. So over the course of that workshop, we were able to create 3 river cane baskets as well as various mats with some Cherokee patterns, because those were our teachers, but then also really starting to explore the idea of creating our own patterns through our stories, right? So I talked about that first woman story with the butterfly. So I've worked, which I have not actually made the mat yet, I'm going to try to make it this weekend, is a river cane mat with the butterfly being in the center of the mat surrounded by a bunch of hearts, right? So kind of very geometric patterns that are able to tell stories of creation and tradition. One other thing that we've been able to recently do within our focus of the project is actually visit those artifacts at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. So myself, my sister, and a friend of ours at the Cultural Center were able to actually go and document in detail, describe, count splints, count weavers, and actually map out patterns that we can really hopefully create ones that have more meaning to our tribe, like the baskets seen in these pictures. We also got to see some white oak baskets. I do white oak basketry in addition to river cane, and got to explore the fish traps that our people used to make. These were made in the early 1900s. So that's really when basketry was lost in the tribe, was early 1900s, and then sort of revitalized in the last couple of years. So an important part of this isn't just now there's 3 people making baskets, it's that there needs to be that intergenerational transfer of knowledge. And so while we haven't done it yet with river cane, we have done it with our white oak classes, where we've actually gone through the process by which to go from the natural material in the field all the way to a basket. So we had a series of classes this spring and winter with the Cultural Center, where we were able to harvest an oak tree and actually split it down into splints. And then we took those splints and we went through the dyeing process, where we dyed them with a bloodroot dye that we collected on the reservation, as well as bloodroot and black walnut. I don't remember which one I just said. And then ultimately took those splints and those dyed splints to teach citizens how to make a basket, right? And so some of them were people who had made baskets in the past, but mostly used sort of commercial reed or rattan. And then others were completely new, and this was their first basket. And, you know, it was a great learning process, not only for them, but also for the teachers like myself in the class, because we really learned that some people just don't have the time or patience to go from a tree all the way to a basket. So like the person on the far right is one of our basket makers within the tribe, and he's like, this was fun, but I don't think I'd ever do it again. And so it's really been eye-opening to me and my sister and the others at the Cultural Center that the next phase is really not to teach adults, but really to go to the children and start teaching children, because those are the people that are going to be the future basket makers of the tribe, because they're going to have the patience and the skill to dedicate to it, whereas someone in their 30s and 40s is like, hard pass. But I'm just insane, so I've taken it on, and I'm like, I'm going to make a lot of baskets. So the last thing is really about forming those strong partnerships or binding that rim. We currently have 1,000 acres of reservation land. I can't remember how many millions of acres it was before we were restricted to any reservation, but it was the Piedmont region of North and South Carolina, as well as up into Virginia. So a lot more land. And so we don't have that land to be able to have massive cane breaks, right? We have to have housing. We have to have a hospital. We have to have a school. We have to have all these things that keep a society existing in the modern day, that there's not a lot of land to preserve for river cane. So we've actually started to work a lot with local entities that are really there to preserve land, to be able to really make them aware of river cane as a species, want to steward it themselves with the help of the tribe, and then work on ways in which people can actively access those resources to make baskets and other things. So a few of those are land conservancies in the area, and they're all at sort of varying levels of official partnership or not, but we have an active agreement with the York County Parks. We're working on a co-stewardship agreement with the South Carolina Parks. And then we also sort of have other land conservancies and the Catawba Riverkeeper, who actively want to partner with us to really help us preserve these resources. Catawba Riverkeeper actually just launched a survey for their membership when they see river cane or think they see river cane, is to map it, and then they'll kind of keep it in a catalog that they'll share with the nature, so that we can go or double check that it is river cane, and then figure out how healthy of a population it is to see if it's worth kind of putting as a priority for stewardship and preservation. With Catawba Lands Conservancy, they have their people go out and check the easements. And so anytime they're checking easements, they're also checking for river cane for us. And actually, I found some of the best river cane in the area. So I'm super excited to continue working with them to be able to gain access to those populations, to be able to see what they truly look like on the ground, and then also how we might be able to help those landowners conserve that resource, and then also partner with the tribe to get access to it. And so that really expands our land base without it actually being a land back situation. Although if any of you have land and want to give it back, domination. So the last thing, obviously none of this would be possible without our partners. So we started off with a grant from the Natural Resource Conservation Service as well as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And then that was mostly for invasive species removal. And then we've sort of moved into the United South and Eastern Tribes, which is a conglomeration of tribes in the east and southern region of the United States, where they were able to actually help us build our greenhouse and then really fund a lot of those cultural elements of the project in addition to the work that we're doing on the ground. And then we also received a $4.8 million grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation through the America the Beautiful Challenge. The River Cane project is sort of existing in the future through there. Not all $4.8 million is going to that, but will be sort of the lift for staff capacity to be able to continue the on-the-ground work of doing that restoration. And most importantly, I can't possibly be remiss without thanking our wonderful mentors. So we, in addition to learning River Cane, we also learned white oak through this process because it's a little bit easier to work with. So Jeff Gottlieb taught us white oak basketry, and then our Eastern Band of Cherokee teachers, Michelle Long and Waylon Long, as well as Gabe Crow, were instrumental in helping us restore this vital tradition to the tribe. So what's the common theme, right? It's all about relationships. It's relationships, importantly, with our land. It's relationships with the plants, the river cane, which has now opened up relationships to black walnut and bloodroot and all these other plants that are just as important as the river cane itself because they're used in the process of being able to create those beautiful stories, and then ultimately relationships with our people, because it's important that we don't just restore ecosystems, it's restoring that relationship to those ecosystems for people to want to steward into the future. I will leave you with a beautiful quote from Robin Wall Kimmerer from her Braiding the Sweetgrass in the chapter Super Fun and Sacred, which is a wonderful chapter about sort of how people view land. And she writes, in the indigenous worldview, a healthy landscape is understood to be whole and generous enough to be able to sustain its partners. Restoration requires renewing the capacity not only for ecosystem services, but for cultural services as well. Biocultural restoration raises the bar for environmental quality of the reference ecosystem so that as we care for the land, it will once again care for us. Restoring land without restoring relationship is an empty exercise. It is relationship that will endure and relationship that will sustain the restored land. Therefore, reconnecting people and the landscape is as essential as reestablishing proper hydrology or cleaning up contaminants. It is medicine for the earth. So when you think about conservation, think of it in tandem with people and their relationships with it, not as something to be viewed and not touched, right? I think that restoring that relationship to land will make our restoration and conservation go so much further, because then people see the value because it touches them personally, whether it's making those beautiful baskets or mats or whatever it might be. So with that, I don't think I'm taking questions right now, but thank you. And the video just sort of goes through some of the, why that basketry tradition is so important to the tribe now. And it was filmed by United South and Eastern Tribes back for Earth Day. So it's Earth Day related, but every day is Earth Day. So let's celebrate the Earth. Although the river cane in that video, the
Tanake, Nia Aaron Baumgardner, Ye Katabare, Ye
Oh no,
Swangre.
there's more. Stop. It's a nightmare where I hear myself talk all the time. Anyways, are there any questions? I will gladly take questions. Yes.
Can non-natives attend the workshops?
So we currently at the Cultural Center only teach to Catawba citizens, their families, and also employees of the tribe. So there's quite a few things that we definitely don't teach non-native people. That's our pottery and sort of dancing and drumming traditions. basketry sort of in a place where, again, we lost it. So it's not like it's uniquely ours anymore, that we're sort of contemplating whether it's something that we're willing to show to the outside world. Yes. But thank you for the question. Yes.
In terms of locating cane populations, have you looked at iNaturalist?
I haven't myself, but I know that it's definitely a great tool to use. So I have not tried taking pictures with iNaturalist of river cane and actually seeing whether it identifies correctly. I haven't tried. I should try that when I get back.
I bet
Yeah.
the identifications would be correct.
Yeah,
The trick would be if it was on private land or something. You'd have
yeah,
to figure that out.
for sure. Any other questions? Also, sorry that I talk so fast. I thought this was going to be a lot longer presentation, but sometimes I just zoom. Yes.
Thank you so much. It was really, I found myself really emotional a couple times during your presentation in just the power of the reconnection. And that's specific. I've been watching this program. I actually grew up in Catawba territory, though I'm Lumbee. And it's been so beautiful to watch all of the work that y'all are doing. And it seems so connected to each other. You know, the work that's happening on the land, connecting back with the cultural traditions and the basketry and the pottery. And the work on the farm too. And so I'm just wondering about, like I'm thinking about that picture of your, was it your great grandmother?
My great grandma. Yeah.
That was so profound to me to see. And thinking about
Three greats, actually. Not two.
three great
Yeah.
great
Forgot the other
grandmother.
great.
Yes, let's honor
Sorry.
her. I grew up in y'all's beautiful red clay, and that's why I also turned to pottery. But to see that generationally was just so profound. And then I remember seeing just on social media y'all's trip up to DC, and returning back into relationship with these baskets that are 100 years old. And it's just amazing. And so I'm wondering if there's any other of those stories or kind of like moments that you'd be willing to share from people that you've seen in community. I've seen a lot of work that y'all are doing with the youth and with the elders, and if there's just any of those like personal stories that you'd be willing to share.
Yeah. So like in the work that I do, right, I have strived to make sure that anything's culturally significant, right? So I always advise with our cultural center. In the work in natural resources, if it's not culturally relevant, I don't think it's worth going after, right? So there's always got to be those ties to culture, because I think it, again, adds that extra element of being important and valuable. I think that the most emotional that I've ever gotten, besides the many curse words that I've said while making a basket, is probably that DC trip, because we just had that one picture of that river cane basket to actually go up there and touch and hold and know that that was not necessarily one of my direct ancestors, but that the same great grandmother that was in that picture was alive at the time that that basket was made, was really important to me, just in the sense that like all this work was to honor their legacy and to bring back things that allowed them to survive on the land and have that connection to nature, and that we're really trying to restore those connections to nature so that we don't lose those traditions in the future. Luckily, I didn't cry onto the basket, but definitely was emotionally moving. We do work with our youth and our seniors. I know the cultural center in particular works with the seniors, but within the natural resources department, we've really started to offer different internship opportunities for college age youth to be able to work for the tribe, right? So hopefully inspiring the next generation of leaders within the natural resources department, where we had someone who was doing box turtle tracking, box turtle tracking, and is now doing her master's at Winthrop, which is a local university, and is focusing on land use changes on the reservation and future land use and connecting it to turtle movement. So she tracks those turtles. So, it's really pushed people to progress in their careers. We also had an intern last summer who worked on the farm. She was in high school, still is in high school, and she just became a co-author on a research paper, and Plants, People, Planet, or whatever the journal is. And it was specifically about labor and yield demands for Three Sisters agriculture when planted in monoculture versus polyculture. So, it's really trying to motivate our youth to stay connected to the tribe, and want to work for the tribe and really want to give back to the tribe. I didn't grow up on the reservation. I grew up in the Midwest. That's why I sound not like a Southerner. And so I didn't have much of a connection to the tribe until I started working for the tribe, which was about 3 years ago. We always had that sort of storied history of our pottery tradition in Ohio when I lived there, but there wasn't much connection outside that. So, starting to work for the tribe was really a way in which I was able to become culturally immersed. And it's definitely been difficult sometimes to figure out where those disconnects between work and my personal life are. But one thing that I'm super grateful for is just the opportunity by which this has really made me explore my art. So, I almost enjoy art more than natural resource management at this point, and have loved the idea of bringing back this basketry tradition. I never thought that I was going to be the person making baskets. I kind of was excited for the cultural center to attend these workshops and, be hands off. But then we started with 7 people, and then it slowly started to dwindle. And so it's a lot of work, right? A lot of splinters. Someone went to the hospital because they cut themselves with river cane. And so it went from 7 people to those 3 people, myself, my sister, and the other person who works at the cultural center named Cassidy. And so, we are the people who need to disseminate that information to the tribe and really start to work with our younger generation in particular to disseminate that knowledge so it's not lost. Thank you for the question.
That's really amazing. I have a follow-up to, this is not what we asked you to come and speak about,
Yeah.
but you've mentioned the farm, and
Oh,
I
yeah.
think y'all's work on the farm, when we got to see the greenhouse, is also so amazing, and we've gotten to see a little glimpse into that, but I'm wondering if you can share with folks who may not be familiar
For sure.
about the farm and
Yeah.
that other side of the work that y'all are doing.
So the Natural Resources Department also oversees all of our agriculture. I don't look at this side of the room enough, so I'm going to look over here. The Natural Resources Program also oversees all of our agricultural programs, and some people will be like, what? Natural Resources over in charge of agriculture? But if you kind of take away anything, all these systems are interconnected. Culture, agriculture, natural resources, whatever it might be, they're very one and the same. And so the farm was actually started as a COVID project by a working group of our wellness department, some citizens, our clinic, and a bunch of different people, land managers, and really saw a need to establish a community farm that really addressed the inadequacies of the food system during the beginning days of the global pandemic. And so it's been 3-4 years in the making or so. And has really come a long way from the beginning when it was just an empty plot of land to now a functional farm that has about 3.5 acres in production. We have probably about 20 or so chickens that provide fresh eggs to the community. But what has actually really been great about the farm as a starting point is we've been able to utilize that as a way to leverage other ways in which to receive funding. So we have over $3 million collectively for local food purchase assistance money from the United States Department of Agriculture and South Carolina Department of Agriculture, where we're able to buy food from women farmers, Black farmers, Hispanic farmers, and our own farm and other Native people within our community. A lot of our community members just raise chickens and we buy their eggs from them. And then we distribute that food to our community for free. So the farm really started as a way of which to get free food, but now we have this sort of market that acts as a food pantry where we're serving between 250 to 500 families every month and giving out about $60,000 to $70,000 worth of groceries every month for free to our citizens. I have not bought eggs or milk in a while, and it's good, right? So part of the work that I am now doing, because this funding is eventually going to run out, is try to figure out ways in which it sustains itself to some ability, because our community has come to depend on it, and really going to the community and asking them, is this something that you would pay minimal amounts for? So if we could subsidize it, because it is more expensive produce because it's local, There's no chemicals, things like that. It's healthier. A lot of people have noticed changes in their health because they're relying a lot more on this really locally sourced and healthy food instead of going to the nearest grocery store, which is a Food Lion, or the nearest place to buy anything, which is a gas station, right? So it's nice to have this resource on tribal land. So trying to figure out how that sustains itself into the future is important. And the things that we've really focused on at the farm are culturally significant things. So when I first came on, I learned about Rue, George Warren's work, where he had rematriated a flour corn. And so we were able to actually grow that corn on the tribal farm for the first time in 2022, and went from one small jar of corn seeds to 5 5-gallon buckets of corn seed, plus over 100 and some pounds of food for the community. And that's only grown with our partnership with Davidson College, where they're actually devoting land on their farm to grow out corn for us. And then we'll do a harvest event. And then right now I need to nixtamalize quite a lot of corn sometime this month, hopefully. But it's been great. And then it's kind of led us to find a bean that's very similar to the description of our bean. It's sort of like a lima bean that's black and white, it's speckled beautifully, and then also kind of open up other opportunities to bring culturally significant crops back to the people's diets, because most people are just eating sweet corn, but now we're able to actually introduce flour, hominy. Everyone eats grits, but not nixtamalized grits. So a healthier form of corn into people's diets. Thank you again for the question. Any other questions?
That's really amazing. I'll pass the microphone, but also would just like to say publicly, Catawba Nation's been so supportive of our tribes in North Carolina, and these borders are colonial. We've always been in relationship with each other, but we really appreciate you driving all the way up here to us. And I'm sure that there's other questions that we pass this.
You look like you want to raise your hand. Maybe not. Okay.
I do have a question. I was just going to wait because my question is about you talk a little bit about the staining, the dyeing process. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I saw that you said that you use walnut, and obviously here we use walnut too for dyeing and medicinal purposes and everything. Could you talk a little bit more about that process? I'm really curious.
Yeah. So the part of the walnut that dyes the best for baskets is simply the hull. So the outside part that's like that fleshy yellow part until it oxidizes and starts to turn black. So really just mashing up that into a bucket and then literally pouring water on it. Within minutes, it's black. And then you boil a splint for however long. So the splints in the class that we dyed, which came out to be a light brown on white oak baskets, was dyed for maybe 3 or 4 hours on a low heat. But then more recently, I just had a dye pot on my stove. I would have it boiling in the afternoon and then turn it off and then let it cool down and then keep the stuff in it for like a couple of days, and it got almost completely black. So it's just really time dependent on how dark it gets. When it comes out of the pot, it's usually darker than what it'll actually dry. So it'll dry a lighter shade. There is a white walnut or a butternut that's very closely related to black walnut that will dye darker. So these earrings, the blackest bit of them are that butternut, whereas if there's any brown, which I don't think there is brown, would be black walnut. River cane dyes a little bit differently than white oak just because it's less porous because of that waxy outer epidermal layer. So it does take a little bit more time to get color into river cane. It's just time.
And is there a fixing process, or once you dye it, it's done?
Yeah, so you don't have to use mordant or anything like that. It stains. You can use mordants, I believe. I haven't really explored that. I dye in an aluminum pot, which I believe the fact that it's an aluminum pot sort of acts like a mordant for dyeing. So it kind of helps it fix, but they stick, the dyes.
Thank you.
Of course. Yes.
And how do you,
I just wonder how you crack the nut. Those black walnuts, they're really tough.
So if you saw in the picture, if I can get there, let's see here. We use these clubs. Let's see here. Yeah, so we had like this this really cool like little divot where a walnut perfectly fit in it, and then my sister would sort of whack it to get it to sort of separate from itself, but then I would sort of like mash it up a little bit so that it'd start oxidizing faster. My dad recently went to an auction. He lives in Ohio and he works with a lot of Amish people, and they simply use a corn desheller. So they run a walnut through like something that takes the kernels off a corn cob. So he bought me one, and I'm going to try using that because anytime I've done it, I use gloves, and my gloves always break because I'm ripping apart at it, and I always dye my finger a dark brown. So that takes weeks, and the fingernail, it's got to grow out before you don't have a dyed fingernail. Yeah. Thanks for the question. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you know if, let's say like 500 years ago, you could have found a river cane basket, somewhere else in the country? Had there been a lot of tribal trading?
That's a good question.
Do you know?
So river cane, like its natural habitat, goes up into like the Midwest, up into Virginia, down into Florida, and then all the way over into Arkansas and Oklahoma. There's obviously a lot of wow, it's really getting rough out there. But I think they found them in like caves in Arkansas and things like that. I'm sure they've existed out west and things like that. I don't know if there's much archaeological evidence of that. They don't preserve well in the southeast just because of our soil. So like, there's not a lot of archaeological preserved items in the southeast just because our soil destroys any organic matter. But good question.
Chittimontes maintains the tradition too. They had them.
There's in a cave they found something. Yeah. Any other questions? Thank you again. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Erin. We do have a gift for you, which I'm going to walk up here and give to you. We had mentioned this earlier, but at our first plant symposium a couple of years ago, the Waccamaw Siouan women sitting here at the front table did a cattail basket weaving, or we did mats first, but a weaving workshop that was really popular. And I'll say the natural dyes is a big topic of conversation that I know a lot of our folks around here have been really interested in, maybe some workshops for our native people here. I do know the garden here has some native dye plants on display. If you go and walk over towards this side of the garden area, just throwing that out there. Yeah, so thank you so much. And I think, Ryan, are you ready? Are you ready to come up for a few minutes?
So, like I said, my name is Ryan Dial. I'm a citizen of the Lumbee tribe, and I work here at the UNC American Indian Center. So my title does not include botany, ethnobotany, or much to do with plants, but I am a program manager specifically for American Indian health. So definitely our environment, learning about our environment, the plants around us has a big part of the health and well-being of our people. So while I'm not an expert in really any kind of environmental science, I'm definitely a student of it and want to learn more about all of our native plants, and especially how they better our health and well-being. It's on there, right? Because I feel like it's barely hanging on. It's like hanging on to like a strand of my hair. Right. So one thing I want to talk about is another example of river cane restoration and its use in the cultures of Southeastern people. So as we talked about, baskets is one of them. Another use that kind of got mentioned, had like a little cameo, is for flute making and flute playing. So I'm gonna go to my paper here, so I don't have slides, so I got to make sure I don't ramble. So American Indian flutes is now seen as this example, kind of like Kevin mentioned, like pan-Indianism, so it's ubiquitous among American Indian peoples. But one of the cool things is it's kind of one of the only examples of, it was almost always pan-Indian, meaning that native flutes in some way and style are kind of ubiquitous among many indigenous cultures all over North America, even into like Central and South America. Those are more like ocarinas, which very similar to flutes, just made out of clay and different style. But many native cultures across this area had some kind of American Indian flute. However, the stories and their use and how they came to be is a little different. And they're a big example of how this culture shows up in many parts of our land and in many native cultures, but it does have these distinguishing factors, and that usually is based on geography, meaning so these flutes are not just made out of different materials, but also have different relationships with the people and land because the land is different everywhere. But flutes are very, very old. I mean, there's some of the original instruments alongside the drum and the rattle, again, also kind of ubiquitous among native people. But they're very old instruments, at least a couple thousand years old. And I mean, so not only are they ubiquitous among indigenous cultures of North America, but really cultures all over the world have variations of flutes and woodwind instruments. So it's just one of those things, like music in general, that kind of reminds us how connected we are as indigenous people and also just as humans. Making music and expressing ourselves in this performative art style is something that's just innately human, and it's a part of our identity as Native people and our identity as people. So, like I said, flutes would have been made in a variety of different materials and woods, but here in the Southeast, they mainly would have been made out of river cane. And when I explain a little bit how flutes are made, it's gonna click because river cane makes it actually so much easier to make a flute for a lot of reasons. So just how flutes are made is kind of different, I've noticed, than what people expect. So one kind of misinformation going out there is, like, when you blow air into a flute to get the sound, it doesn't go from one end to the other. Unfortunately, it's a little more complicated. That's why if you ever see me play, you don't actually put the end of it at the microphone, because that's not where the sound actually comes out. So I'm gonna pass this around. This is a piece of river cane that is like in the beginning stages of being a flute. My uncle started it for me, who's a flute player. I had planned on finishing it, but it makes such a good demonstration piece for like how flutes work. I'm elected to leave it like this. I'll just pass that around. So how flutes actually work is kind of interesting. And this is all flutes. That's one of the unique things about American Indian flutes is they can have different sounds and different tones, but really the template of how to make them does not change. Doesn't matter what kind of wood you use. If you use river cane, they all have the same structure and anatomy. So what happens is, we know which direction the air is coming into. So there's a mouthpiece at one end. But what happens is as it goes through, there's a stop right here in the middle. So if you look on that one, I know it's kind of hard to see. Where the stop is, there's a hole on one side and a hole on the other. And that's one of the reasons why river canes make really good flutes, is because the stop's already there. So you would make the holes right where the note is. Because in this species of cane, and some are different, but in this species, it's blocked. So these grow in these sections. They start and they grow on top of each other. So right here at the node, it's already just naturally blocked, which takes one of the steps out of making a flute. So what happens is there's two holes. So the air is going to go up. So now you have to figure out how do you make it go back down. And that's where this kind of reed, or anytime you see flutes, the kind of decorative piece is not just there for decoration. That's there to create a gap, a really small gap, so the air can go up and then back down. Here on that river cane pass around, you'll notice there's a notch carved in between the holes. So all you have to do is lay a flat reed over there, and it's just creating compression. So that's how you get a really full sound out of a flute without having to blow that much air into it, is because the air is going to come out way faster than you blow into it. On flutes like these, there's still two holes up top, but the notch is actually it's called a fetish, in the decorative piece. But same principle, it's like barely visible. Most people don't notice it. They think it's flush right across, but there's just enough space that the air can shoot back into the flute. And because it's coming out a lot faster, when it gets in this chamber, it just starts bouncing around. So that's how you get the full sound out of it. And then the holes are there. So really what you do when you lift the holes up is you're actually just going to keep making the flute shorter. So the longer the flute, when you make it, you're going to get a lower pitch, a deeper sound, versus shorter flutes are going to have a higher pitch. So when you lift up the holes, you're just making the flute shorter. You're allowing the air to escape a lot sooner. I'm gonna play more. Don't worry, that's just my demonstration piece. Yeah, so that's why, I mean, river canes are really great for making flutes. Again, they're already in the shape you need. Really, I mean, all you have to do is just dry it, which probably would have been done by smoking it over a fire at a low heat, getting all the moisture out of it, carving the 2 holes, and native people even thousands of years ago did have drills. But if you notice here, these holes actually weren't drilled in. So this is made by a Cherokee Nation artist, Tommy Wildcat, who specializes not just in flute music, but he makes river cane flutes. If you notice here, the outside of the holes are all black, right? That's because this wasn't drilled into. So the older styles of drills were, you know, they could be pretty precise, but they still had this large counterweight, and they were used for like drilling stones and wood. A little hard for something delicate like a river cane. So these holes are actually burned. So that black around them is just natural from, they put the ash right there and just blow on it just enough to let it burn through the one end and then get it out. So it doesn't, you don't want it burning all the way through. Same thing here. Instead of like sanding it to make it smooth, it's just dipped in a fire a little bit, or some hot ash really. It doesn't need to be extremely hot to smooth out the edges so you don't get splinters while you're playing it. So Tommy Wildcat, again, he's a flute player and a modern flute player, but he specializes in making these river cane flutes in the traditional way. So again, this is something that's kind of common in all Southeastern cultures, is the flute and making flutes into river canes. So with that, there's a lot of stories about how flutes came to be and their purpose in American Indian cultures. Again, it's going to differ depending on the people telling those stories. And this is an instrument that's going to be found in cultures all over North America. So its origins and its uses in the community is going to vary slightly. And it's also going to vary between, you know, traditional stories that are specific to tribes and kind of modern, more pan-Indian examples of the flute and its use in our communities. But like all aspects of our culture, our music and the flute has evolved, and, you know, its purpose originally is still used today, but like with many other aspects of our culture, it is adapted to a modern form and takes on whatever meaning the person playing it wants it to be. You know, flutes are very personal. Compared to our other instruments, like our rattles and drums, are typically meant to be done in groups, so like in ceremonies, in social dances. However, flutes is the one instrument where traditionally, probably not played in a group. It's something very personal. So it would be something like a flute player would also have to be their own flute maker. I have broken that tradition because I haven't tried yet. We'll see. Maybe I'll get around to finishing that one that's being passed around. But as of now, I'm a flute player, not a flute maker. I just am aware of how they're made, but that's very different than me going out and making, I mean, Tommy Wildcat can make like 100 of these in one go. So we're not there yet, but that's how it would have been traditional, because it's a very personal kind of instrument, because some of the teachings I have about it, the reason for that is because you have to give some of yourself for it to even work. You have to give it your own breath for the flute to, quote, come alive, because in essence, what it's doing is it's singing for you. That does not mean that there's not some skill involved to it, but that's kind of the idea of a flute, is it's personal because it comes from you. You know, the flute will play you the song, but you have to give a little something in return. And what you're giving is, you know, a limited resource, our breath, our little bit of life. So I don't want to say playing the flute takes years off my life, but that's the way I think about it. And its importance is that, you know, it costs something to play. And that's why, you know, they're personal. You know, even though I don't make the flutes, you know, it's still part of the maintenance. And that's why it's important for me to learn how they were made, even if I don't do them, just knowing the own anatomy of this instrument, how to maintain it, how to take care of it, how to make it sound its best at any given time. And just like with all of our culture, you know, it has a lot of importance. So there's a couple stories that I was taught. Again, going to be a little more specific to this region and these cultures about the flutes. One is more of an origin story about how the flute came to be. And I mean, Kevin, I think you mentioned before how a lot of our stories really have nothing to do with humans. We're either bystanders, or the story of the flute actually takes place before there were humans, when we still had these communities of our four-legged and our winged brothers and sisters and our aquatic brothers and sisters, they lived in community and they communicated, they spoke language. And that's why you see a lot of Native American mythology, as academics call it. I think it's something to be said, when you hear stories and humans are not the main characters anymore. That's something we're not used to in a Eurocentric kind of mindset, is that nature and the natural world can and will and has existed without you. It will continue to. It did for years before we got here. And that's kind of how the story of the flute begins. Is actually made by the animals. One very specific animal, a bird that's found here in North Carolina, all over the Southeast. And this was made by a specific bird that could not sing on its own. So it wanted to make an instrument that would sing for it. Come on now, the elementary school kids can get this. Anybody want to take a guess who I'm talking about? It's a woodpecker, yeah. That's actually specifically why I got woodpecker tattoos on my arm. To me, that's, paying respects to the original flute maker, in the hopes it would make me a better flute player. We'll see. Got a long ways to go. So yeah, this story starts, again, long before humans, and it was the woodpecker who kind of accidentally made the first flute. That wasn't his intention, but in this story, woodpecker couldn't sing on its own, but he actually wanted to. That was a goal of his, because as I'm sure many of us know, you wake up early in the morning. I'm not one of them because I like to sleep. But if you wake up at the right time, you get serenaded. Here in North Carolina, here in the Southeast, we have many different species of songbirds right here. Sparrows, robins, blue jays, cardinals, all kinds of songbirds. So that's the same thing with woodpecker. He had to wake up every morning and hear these songs, knowing that he couldn't add to it. He couldn't sing his own song. So he would, as the story goes, he would try and fail. He would try. From what I hear, his version sounded something like this. I heard maybe he'd, take another step. How birds you always see them puff their chests out. They got these massive lungs compared to their body. So from what I hear, that's about as far as woodpecker would get. So he'd go through this cycle over and over. He'd try and fail and try and fail, until eventually he just gave up. He was like, all right, you know what? I'm not going to be a songbird. But that doesn't mean woodpecker wasn't talented. Woodpecker was a woodworker. So not only is he up there eating in the trees, getting his nutrients, but originally, according to these stories, woodpecker was an artist, and he would make things out of these woods for other animals, weapons, tools, decorations, art pieces. So he was very talented. So one day, while woodpecker was finished working in the tree, he got down, and a little bit of wind came by, and it snapped this branch off, huge branch, and it landed right in front of woodpecker. And he stopped freaking out from almost getting crushed, and he looked, and he was like, I bet you I can make something really cool out of that. So we drug that branch back to his home, and he was like, I don't know what I'm gonna do, but I bet you'd make a great, soup spoon, war club, something good. So he started to work, he sanded it down, got it the right size. And like many of our great artists we know, he fell asleep right in the middle of it, right there at his desk. And in this dream woodpecker had, he was going through the same forest every day, and he saw these 7 chipmunks running right in a straight line, and then went right past him. He was like, okay, I don't know what they're in a hurry for. And then looked over in the stream, and he saw these 7 fish in a straight line swimming right past him. He was like, I wonder if there's something I haven't been invited to. And then he looked over top of them, and he saw these 7 birds flying in a straight line right on top of him. And he was like, wait, birds don't fly in a straight. And then he woke up. And when he looked in this branch, it had 7 holes, just like he saw in his dream, carved in the front of it. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then everybody missed the 7th one right here. So he was like, okay, I don't know what I was thinking in the middle of the night, but now I guess I can't make a weapon or a tool out of it, but I'll make it look good, and maybe somebody will hang it up on their wall. So he finished it up, made it look good, and then he did something unique. He put his signature on it, but not like this European signatures we're used to. He carved a beak at the top of it. So even though this one doesn't have as many details, Traditionally, when you see flutes like this and they have a beak at the front, it's supposed to represent woodpecker. So that's his signature. So he took it with him, went to all of his usual customers. You know, Deer liked to cook, so he was like, hey, Deer, check out what I got. And he was like, I don't know, man. I can't, not a good like soup spoon. I can't really make stews with this. Let me know what else you got. And then he took it to Bear, Warrior. He was like, hey, Bear, check out what I got. Bear's like, I don't know, man. It's not very pointy. It's not heavy enough to like hurt somebody with it. You take it. Let me know what else you got. But Woodpecker was determined to get rid of this. He had worked really hard on it. He thought it looked really nice. So he kept it with him and he tucked it up under his wing just like that. And he kept it with him while he's working up in his favorite trees. He liked them really tall trees. You know, he'd eat lunch, get more wood pieces. And he's up in this tree way at the top, and the wind starts blowing a little bit. So he starts rocking, a little back and forth, front and back, side to side. And then the wind picks up, and then he really starts moving. So now he's holding on for dear life on top of this tree, and he's going every kind of direction there is, holding on, trying not to fall off, until a gust of wind came right by him and hit him right at the right angle. And it sounded just like this. So then he starts moving around trying to figure out where that's coming from, and he starts lifting his wing a little bit over all these 6 holes. And then it starts to sound like this. While he's doing that, all the other animals can see him, and they're trying to figure out where is that new song coming from, because it didn't sound like all the regulars, you know. Cardinal was like, not mine, I'm not singing. Robin was like, doesn't sound like mine. They didn't even bother asking Crow. And then they notice this woodpecker, and that's where the sound has come from. They're like, that doesn't make any sense. Woodpecker can't sing, but somehow he's making this beautiful song that nobody's heard before. So eventually the wind stops, and, you know, woodpecker's all tense, so he climbs down the tree. And then they're like, hey, there's that branch he kept trying to get rid of. He got that branch to sing. How did he do that? So then they realize that, you know, like I said, it requires wind or breath, the thing that we have, you know, it requires part of yourself in order to get a song out of it. So then everybody, people we had just asked, were like, hey, I want one. Can you make one for me? And then that's how woodpeckers spend the rest of his time. He went around and he found just branches that had came down off trees, and they were all different sizes. So some of them were medium-sized. Some of them were a little larger. I imagine this was Bear's right here. He liked a little bass in his flute. I have a pocket flute, and I left it in my car, but I do have one. It's like 7 inches. So that's how that is today. Flutes come in all shapes, sizes, different tones, scales. But woodpecker didn't do anything different. He made them the exact same way. He carved those 7 holes. They're all hollow to a certain point. Even ones that aren't river cane, they still are made the same way. They have that stop right in the middle, and you get that full sound. So that's a story. We'll hear very different ones. There's a lot of stories in the Southeast. Another example of like pan-Indianism, culture that's associated with all Native people, but it's really not, is Kokopelli. I know we've seen it on some coasters, on some pottery. My mom's probably got a rug somewhere. But Kokopelli is known as the wandering flute player, and he's actually a fertility like deity. And that goes into another use of flutes as a courting instrument. But that's something kind of specific to the Hopi and people of the Southwest. Again, it gets conflated with other Native culture all over, but again, all Native people have their own stories. Even though they all have flutes, there's their own stories about how the flute came to be, how they made them, and their use for it. I will say using flutes as a courting instrument is something that, at the very least today, not 100% sure about, pre-colonial, but at least today is something that's common among flute players. That's why most flute players typically are men. However, like with all aspects of our culture, it's adapting, and I guess it depends on who you ask. People have different opinions. I personally have no problem with anybody playing the flute because it's your own purpose why you learn it and why you do it. But that's why the at least historically, it was mostly men because flutes were also used as courting instruments. So there are many stories about that, but traditionally, again, it would be a man who would, however they say it these days, spit game, shoot a shot, not notice a woman, farming by the river, however it went. Kind of the courting process back then is you not just obtain a flute, you'd have to make your own flute. So that means going to elders and other musicians and learning how to make it, how it's done, doing it yourself, and learning your own songs. And it was, from what I was taught, you go through all that process, give it your best shot, play for a woman you want. This is not, early 20th century Disney. I couldn't tell you how it went, could go either way. But what I was taught is that if it worked and there was a marriage ceremony between this man and woman, part of that ceremony is actually the man destroying that flute. So that signifies that he can never play that flute for another woman. I've got all mine so far. I told the Dallas one day, we'll just get us a blank river cane and I'll break it over my knee, Not this one though, or probably the other ones in my bag. But that's the thought behind it, is that, you would never play that flute for another woman. And if for whatever reason it didn't work out, which I don't say was common, but, there was precedence for it. If it didn't work out, you could have another marriage ceremony, but at least the way I feel, you definitely want to be making another flute. Personally, I don't want to be known as the guy who's been playing the same flute for every woman in the village. Personally, not a reputation I want. So that's just a little bit about the history of the flute and kind of their use. Again, that's the traditional use and viewpoint of it. I know I keep saying it because it's so important, but native cultures, all cultures evolve and change and exist in this context, in a modern context. So personally, I kept that tradition. I didn't break the flute, but I did play it, and we're married, so correlation, I don't know. But I played it in that good way, like I was taught. But again, now flutes have every right to just be, like every other art. They have every right to exist with or without a purpose. People have every right to play them. I think the important part is whether or not it's less about the reason you want to play a flute, but I think it is at least important to understand how these came to be. And also just what we're talking about today is that flutes are such a clear example of the theme of the symposium, and it's our connection to our land and to our place. You see that in this instrument, in the flute. I've been asked my entire life what it means to be Indian or what it means to be Lumbee. I grew up in an urban area. I did not have many Native people go to my school. I did not have Native teachers until I went to college. So that was a question I've been asked every step of the way in my entire life. And now, more recently, I think I have a pretty good synopsis of how I see it. So I kind of view these kind of 4 core areas of being Indigenous. And that's, like we talked about, they're all based on relationships. So it's your relationship to your land, because no matter our history, like we just talked about with our genealogy symposium, but Native people, especially in this area, were detribalized and had their identity at every step of the way tried to be removed by calling us everything besides the name that we called ourselves. But regardless of that, some things always stay the same, and that the Lumbee, Coharie, Halawasponi, whatever names they were throughout history, one thing was always the same, in that they knew where their home was. Beyond just coordinates, beyond just address, they knew when they saw these pine trees, cypress, when they saw that river, that was their home. And it went beyond just, this is the place where I happen to live. It's this is where my identity is. So to me, that's one core area of Indigenous is it's always place-based for everybody across North America. It's also the relationship to our communities. And that is another area that, regardless of what our communities have been called or what we have been called, whether it was Indian, whether it was mulatto, we always knew who was our kin and who was not. That was never a question for Native people. We always knew, these are my relatives, this is my community, and none of that has changed today. The third area is our connection to the Creator. And again, it goes beyond the labels that we give our spirituality or our religion, whether or not we choose to be Christian or whether or not we choose to, you know, be traditional or of the Longhouse ways or of any of our traditional ways. We always had a connection to our Creator, and that gave us our purpose and helped us understand what our place was, you know, what our role is in our people's society, in the large society. Why are we here in the world is all about our connection to the Creator. And wow, I said 4, and I'm blanking. That's even more embarrassing because this is coming right out of my own head. Family, land, Creator. Oh, I got it. I had to do a little searching in my filing cabinet. So the last area of, again, and this is, again, it's coming out of my head. I did not read this in a book. This is something I've come to terms with to help answer this question. But that other connection is our connection to our past and to our ancestors. Again, these are things that have not changed throughout history, which is why I know for a fact, and I sleep pretty good at night, knowing that I am indigenous, because I know who my relatives are. I know where I am from, regardless of what city it's called or regardless of what address is on my license. I know my connection to the Creator, and I feel a connection to our past. That is the same things our ancestors had, and that's the same things we still have, regardless of how much of our past was written down, regardless of how much it gets talked about in academics or in history. We've always had an unbroken connection to our peoples of the past and to our ancestors. And it's the physical acts. And what happens is the things that people think makes us indigenous is not really the answer. So things like playing the flute doesn't make me indigenous. Dancing at powwows is not the thing that makes me indigenous. All those protocols, all the procedural things we do are the things to me that helps remind us of those core areas. So no, playing the flute is not the criteria I need to meet for myself to think of myself as indigenous, but it helps me, you know, reconcile all of what I just said, all those areas, all those relationships, because playing this flute keeps me connected to my ancestors, because this is a practice that has remained unbroken for thousands of years, is playing this kind of music. You know, it keeps me connected to my community because I'm not the only flute player in the Lumbee tribe. I'm not the only flute player in North Carolina or in Indian country. It is something that we all get to share and experience together. It connects me to the Creator because, you know, another teaching I have is that, you know, when we sing our powwow style or our social dance, our longhouse style, you know, when we sing together, that's for ourselves, you know, that's for our own community. But when you play the flute, that's for the Creator. You use this piece of His creation, whether it be river cane, whether it be cedar, and you play a song so the Creator can hear you. And it connects, and, you know, like we've been saying, it keeps me connected to our place, because what I play flutes with now is the same thing that my ancestors did. It's that river cane. One of the most common materials is actually red cedar all over. I'll explain why in a minute, but that's kind of by far the most common wood used for flutes. So this practice, the procedural thing, that's not what gives me my indigenous identity, but it helps me achieve all those relationships, again, with place, with our Creator, with our people, and with our ancestors. So I'm going to, how are we doing? Okay, I'm pretty good. I'm gonna play some music, and then I'm gonna play a couple different flutes, again, because each flute has its own song with it. That's why I keep buying more. At least that's what I keep telling the Dallas. Why, like, hey, of course I need an 8th flute, you know, because they're not all the same. I don't have 8 of the same flutes. So I'm gonna play a couple different ones, again, to hear each of the songs that the flute has. I'm actually gonna start with, I should start with the river cane one, since that's the point right here. Which one next? Oh boy, so many options. So this one was actually made by a good friend of mine. I'm not an expert on like wood grain patterns, so I keep saying this. So if somebody is, please let me know if I've been lying to people. But I believe this is poplar. Any objections? That's what I was told.
I'd have to look at it closer.
All right, yeah. Just do it quietly in my ear. I don't want everybody to know I've been lying to them. But again, specific, like when I buy flutes too, I do like to kind of lean towards indigenous trees to this area. So poplar. I'm waiting to get one on pine. I really want a pine flute. Again, red cedar is actually one of the go-tos, not even North Carolina, but just like flute makers nationwide gravitate towards red cedar for a couple different reasons, and or river cane. But again, kind of reinforces that connection to place and, you know, how it affects our identity. This is the one time when I'm like speaking or storytelling that if I do see people nodding off, I don't take any offense to that. That's like, all right, I might be doing something right. That one didn't put you out. This is the big guns right here. So this would be known as like a bass flute. So if I had to define it, this would probably be the average right here. And some of these flutes, most of them, again, in a modern context, are going to be tuned to specific keys. That helps a lot with if you do want to play alongside or write in kind of a music theory kind of way. So if you want to play like sheet music, the key lets you know like what note you're playing, because again, they all follow the same pattern. I got any music theory folks in here? Interesting. Okay. I could go deeper. So it's based on a pentatonic scale, which penta meaning 5. So it's a 5-note scale. That's kind of the base. There are more than 5 notes, but the basic pattern kind of follows around that scale. So 5 notes. And how the key works is this one is the key of D minor, which means that the drone, as it's called, so the lowest note you can play is when all the holes are covered. It's as if you didn't drill any holes at all. That's the bottom. And you can go all the way up an entire octave, maybe a little past it, but the note's starting to break apart a little bit. So it's tuned in D, so that means that the drone is D, and then the top of the scale is a higher D. So that's helpful because now I know what like this note is. You know, I know which one's which. So if I wanted to like pair that with modern music, or if I was playing with the band and they're like, hey, you know, we're gonna play some D chords and the chords sound good with that, I can like pick a specific flute to go with that. So the only song, like modern song I know, unfortunately, is not a happy one. This is by request, because I keep getting asked to play this, sometimes at like random folks' funerals, which I tend to not go for, because I'm like, I don't know you, but when I play, it'll make sense. They'll be like, oh yeah, I've definitely heard that on a flute. requests are endless. And they're like, hey, can you play Amazing Grace at my uncle's funeral? And I'm like, this is why I contemplated even making a website. I'm like, respectfully, no. I can, yes, but I won't. That's the only one I actually got around to like looking up the sheet music, making the notes match up, all that. The rest is more improv, and that's why the pentatonic scale is important. Like even in like jazz music, like the pentatonic's really easy to improv up because all 5 of those notes, like without getting too deep into the theory, they all sound good together. So when you kind of start out learning, or at least what I did, once you get that scale, you just put them in like try out different orders, and they're all more or less like they all match up together. Then just like any other musical instrument, once you kind of learn the bass, you kind of get some notes. It's like, all right, I know these sound good together. Then you add in all that other stuff that makes music music. Because when we listen to songs, it's not just a series of repeating notes. There are things like tone and tempo, getting, crescendo or decrescendo, like your volume. So there's all these other things, and that's how you end up with a song. So learning this really isn't different than learning any other instrument, It's actually not even the first instrument I learned how to play, which kind of affected how I went about learning the flute. As I started in orchestra in middle school. So I play the double bass and electric bass. So that affected how I went about playing it because I treated the flute just like I learned how to play the bass. I figured out the notes, you figure out like the mechanical technique, and most folks when they start, and this is not a sly, I mean, I start like this too, you kind of start with just like learning how to play the drone note, because a lot of people, you're going to hear this. Yeah, that is exactly how I sounded the first time I played the flute. So yeah, but you just go about it like I learned how to play the bass. You got to learn how to hold it. You got to learn how to like make your brain get your fingers to do things in a pattern. And then using both hands. So even with this one, you have to, I'm not ambidextrous, but you have to learn how to control both your hands simultaneously. And then just those simple techniques, how to like fully close a hole, so you get the right note, because that's how you get those in-between notes of the scale, is you actually like half open and half close the holes. So like, so all those little techniques, and you put them all together, and then you add in all the other stuff that makes it music. So this is my last song. Again, I call this one Busting Out the Big Guns. So this is a double barrel flute. It does have its own bag, which I don't want to tell the other ones. It is more special to me and more expensive. This is actually Alaskan yellow cedar. So variation of cedar here, a lot less common. I know here we're used to like red cedar as far as the eye can see. Definitely yellow cedar is not common here, but even in Alaska, it is still, I don't know what its actual designation is, but it's not as populous as like the red cedar here. So like I said before, cedar in many varieties, particularly red cedar, is the most common for flutes because other things can affect the tone of a flute. It's kind of like if you made a trumpet out of plastic, you can still play it and you can play the right notes, but like you can intuitively tell it's not a trumpet because that brass gives a different tone. That's how flutes are. So different kinds of wood, even if you made them exactly the same, will play the same scale, but it will sound different. Typically, and it depends on the hard and softness of the wood, because what you're actually hearing is the flute vibrating. Can't see it, but like that is the sound. Similar to a guitar string, the sound is the string vibrating through the air. That's what you're hearing when I blow into the wood molecules themselves are shaking. So harder woods, like another popular one from some of these flute makers is walnut, a little harder than cedar. It's gonna give you more of that like, and these are my own descriptions, I hope that makes sense, crisp, feel what I'm saying, like crispy sound. That's gonna be like your harder woods like walnut. And then these flutes are from High Spirits. The artist is Ojibwe. He calls this aromatic cedar, but it's, your red cedar, walnut, and Spanish cedar. Spanish is the softer one. That one's gonna give it I don't know how to say it, softer, breathier, warmer kind of tone, even in the exact same flute. And sometimes music terms get weird, but y'all get the gist of what I'm saying. So yellow cedar is a little softer, I found, than red, but it's still close enough. And red cedar is actually more common because it's like right there in the middle. You get a very crisp, good tone out of every note, but it still has kind of a warm and soft feel to it. So that's why red cedar's going to be the go-to for a lot of people. All right, this is my last song from the big guns. I always get played every time. This messes me up. I'm more than happy to take questions. I'm going to go and answer a common one. Yes, twice the flute is twice the breath. So if it looked like I was running out there, I was on E towards the end, in case anyone noticed. But yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions about flutes, about River Cane flutes, that kind of music. Oh, wow, did I take that long? I was so afraid I'd end early. I should have known. Yes.
A musician, you can't sing. Is it unrealistic to think you might can learn how to play the flute?
Oh, you could definitely learn how to play the flute. I'd say, a lot of the flute players I know actually are not like classically trained. It's definitely, not only is it not a requirement, I don't necessarily think that it makes you a better flute player. Again, for me, it just kind of affected because I'd already learned an instrument. Like, I couldn't untrain myself to like read music. So it kind of affected the way I came about learning it. But most of the other people, I'm like the only one I can think of who is also trained in like another instrument first. Most flute players, the good thing about the flute, I personally don't think it's like the hardest instrument to learn. Once you get the techniques down, which is most people's first like roadblock, like once you actually figure out how to like get a good predictable sound out of every like finger pattern, and you kind of work on the breath and getting a good tone, coming up with the songs and phrases is not the hard part, because really you've got like an entire, it's called chromatic scales. When you go from like one note to the other octave, you've got every note in between. And then if you stick, those 5 are a good first base, because the pentatonic scale, again, is the basis for a lot of improv, especially in like, so I also play jazz. That's how I even know this. But it's interesting, again, that's kind of one of the things when you learn like music theory of other cultures, a lot of instruments, without realizing it, are based on like these very predictable like pentatonic or diatonic scales, because intuitively in our minds, like we just recognize these are the notes that sound good together. Like even if you don't know music theory, like most people can hear a chord, even if you don't know if it's a D chord, a D minor, a D7, like you can tell when the notes are like vibing together and versus when one is off. So it's interesting how a lot of like, especially ancient, instruments all kind of set around what we consider like music theory today. So short answer to your question, no, most people I know do not have like another music background. They just play the flute and, you know, learn just fine.
Thank you so much, Ryan. We really appreciate